How we doing, everybody? Welcome back to the Sean Atwood channel. I'm Ron Swanson, and I'm here with Kristy Greenberg from Courtside, and of course, from the world of serious legal situations. Kristy, I mean, you're the real deal. I do believe that the firm you used to work for was involved in covering the Diddy case and dealing with things like that, or there's something there. But introduce yourself, Kristy. Tell us about yourself, and we'll get cracking.
Sure. So hi, everyone. My name is Kristy Greenberg. I'm the host of Courtside with Kristy Greenberg on YouTube, where I cover legal cases that high-profile cases that are of interest to all of you. Prior to that, I was a deputy chief of the criminal division of the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York. Same office that prosecuted Jeffrey Epstein, that prosecuted Ghislaine Maxwell, that prosecuted Sean Diddy Combs. So that's an office where a lot of high-profile sex trafficking cases are prosecuted. I both prosecuted those kinds of cases and supervised those cases. So I'm very familiar with how they work, though I had no involvement with those particular cases when I was there.
Yeah, I mean, we say cases like that. I mean, those are the cases. I mean, there aren't bigger cases than this. And it's, you know, I'd like to talk about both of them, right? But just tell us what you feel the most common misconception is with the public and the legal system when it comes to the Diddys and the Epsteins. Like, what do you find that is the most common sort of misconception towards how you build these cases?
Well, all of these cases are built based on victims, right? You can't prosecute a sex trafficking case without victims coming to the government and trusting the government and knowing that the government is going to do everything they can to work the case really hard and make sure that they can, you know, find the evidence and really be in the victim's corner, advocating for victims every step of the way. That is the most important thing, the cornerstone to any of these cases. And so when you have people who are well-connected, who are powerful, who are rich, who have the lawyers who can come in and make it tough for prosecutors to gather that evidence to build their case, those cases, even though they may appear to the public to be a slam dunk based on the evidence, there are lots of ways in which, you know, very powerful lawyers can throw roadblocks in the ways of prosecutors. But it's up to the prosecutors. That's not an excuse. It's up to the prosecutors to keep fighting and to keep working really hard and making sure that any charges stick and that the evidence is solid and corroborated in many different ways. So when you have that kind of a spotlight shined on the cases you're working, it's all the more reason for prosecutors to work that much harder to make sure that the case is solid.
It's that pressure cooker factor, really, isn't it? I mean, it's one thing having bosses and superiors' eyes on you, but when half the world's eyes are on you, that pressure must be unreal. Let's talk about the Diddy case first of all, right? I mean, when Diddy initially went down, the posts and the statements made by the news about terabytes of footage and endless amounts of photos and all this kind of stuff, and it's the same with the Epstein case. Do you feel that the public should know the true extent of everything that went on in these cases? Or do you think, I don't mean airing all the footage, all this illegal, horrible trauma stuff, but do you feel like there's a repeating withholding from the public factor within these cases to protect individuals?
So with respect to the Diddy case, I was in court not every day, but most days. And so I got to see the testimony firsthand. And there is a real difference in hearing from those witnesses live and seeing them on the stand than public reporting about it after the fact. And so I think that there's a real disservice when trials are not televised and people can't make that assessment themselves. Hey, was this witness telling the truth or not? Did that strike me as being credible or not? You know, it's one thing for me to tell you what I think, but I think everybody deserves to be able to see that for themselves. So I think in a lot of these cases, the rules in federal court in the United States are just such that those cases don't really get don't get televised. And I think they should. I think it's I think it's wrong. And I think the Diddy case and the Ghislaine Maxwell trial are perfect examples of why. I think, at least for me, being in the courtroom and hearing from those witnesses, I mean, certainly the victims, certainly the people who are talking about very, very traumatic experiences, you have to see it and hear it to really understand the magnitude of it. So I think that's one way in which, yes, people should be able to see and hear the evidence for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, the Charlie Kirk case, it's been televised. The first part of that was just last week. I believe we're getting ready now for every single one of the witnesses to be questioned and examined based off of one of the prosecutor's relatives having been at the university. It's going to be a mess. It's the definition of dragging some stuff out here. And I believe it's May or March that continues. I believe that when it comes to transparency in cases, especially massive cases like Diddy and Epstein, I think the public have a right to be part of that and to be able to pass judgment and, quite frankly, keep an eye on what's going on. Because when things happen behind closed doors and the public don't really have the ability to make that decision themselves, I believe that leaves us out in the dark. And would you like to see all cases like this be public and televised, or do you think that there's a limit to where we should cut off a case from the public?
I think that, again, when things are, at the stage of a trial where that is happening in public, anybody who is in the courthouse can go to that courtroom and get access to the trial. When it's public anyway, then why not make it so that people can see it? I think in terms of, opening up criminal case files so that, you're going kind of beyond what is public. Sure. That's a trickier question. I think the Epstein case in particular is very specific and unique, and given the multiple institutional failures over a period of 20 plus years, in that circumstance, it is important that there is transparency and that people be able to see the files to really truly understand where the government failed and why. And also, when there are, in that circumstance, so many other potential co-conspirators that victims have said they've been trafficked by 20 plus men, and yet there aren't those charges being brought, I think people want to have a better understanding as to why that happened and whether everything was on the up and up. And, again, given how abnormally things occurred, both from the Southern District of Florida, back 20 years ago, as well as now when you have Ghislaine Maxwell, a convicted sex trafficker who was granted a stay now in essentially a country club prison. She was convicted of sex trafficking of minors, and she is now, being provided her meals, but basically brought to her. She gets to use a gym. She gets a dog therapy session. I mean, it's really, it's unheard of. That's not how sex offenders are treated in the United States in our jails. So when you see things like that start to happen, it does raise these real questions about transparency and wanting to know more, because at that point, people don't feel like they can trust how the government's handled it.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm going to be just very blunt with you here. It seems that the Epstein case and the Diddy case both have layers of suspicion as to how they're being handled and how information's released. And there's some connections to some pretty powerful people. And you can't help wonder how far the corruption spreads, because at one point, Kash Patel was telling us there's no Epstein conspiracy. If we had any files, we would release them. I mean, he went on the Joe Rogan show and said all of this. And then a matter of weeks later, there's new legislation being signed by the president to release the files, and we've had 1% of them. What alarm bell? What's your spidey sense telling you? I mean, can you even talk about it, really, what you think? Because until you add conspiracy to the algorithm of this, it doesn't make any sense. Why wouldn't they be releasing the files? Why would they be protecting people? It makes zero sense to me.
Yeah, so I think I would put Epstein and Diddy in two different buckets. I
Okay.
haven't really seen anything with respect to how the Diddy case was handled that raised real concerns with me that it was handled corruptly. Whereas with Epstein, there are real red flags. The first being that
I would
Trump.
say it would be the withholding
Sorry,
of
go ahead.
evidence. I would say it would be withholding of evidence from the public domain in the Diddy case, where if you've got 4,000 terabytes of information that was not used within the case, and there was individuals that could be identified on those tapes, that's withholding evidence in my eyes. And I'm not a lawyer. I'm just saying it sounds a lot like that to me.
Yeah, so again, from sitting through the trial, it sounds like a lot of the video evidence that they had was of pretty explicit sexual conduct that the victims themselves, through their lawyers, did not want the public to see. And so,
Yeah. It's not so much the
I think with
public
respect
seeing
to
it.
material like that, it is
It's
tough
less
to have
about
transparency.
it's less about airing it to the public, and it's more about identifying the culprits that were within the footage. There was a vast array of individuals at these parties, and I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's no footage of anyone doing any wrongdoing but Diddy and the victims. Maybe that was all media hearsay. It seems very peculiar to me that the buck stopped with Diddy in that case, and there was no one else associated, no one. And it just seems like Hollywood projects this mindset that it's okay if you're a pervert, and in Hollywood we'll sentence you as an individual and down you go. But the minute a whisper of a grander conspiracy comes into things just seem to be handled a little bit peculiar to me.
So I think in the Diddy case, look, he was charged with racketeering, a conspiracy, meaning there were other people who worked with him to do it. That was part of the government's case, that there were bodyguards, that there were assistants, there were various individuals that were helping him, in terms of sexually exploiting these.
Yeah.
It seemed like their strategy was to charge Diddy first. Diddy was acquitted on that racketeering charge, and therefore makes it, if you can't get the top of the conspiracy, it's a whole lot harder for them to go ahead and charge the other people who enabled it and helped him do it. My sense of it, and again, I don't have any personal knowledge of it, was that if they had secured the conviction for him on racketeering, that we could have then seen additional indictments of other people who helped him. But because they didn't, my guess is we're not going to see those. With respect to Epstein, I mean, obviously, within a month of the indictment against him being unsealed, he was dead. So there, we don't have a trial to go on there, but we do have the trial of Maxwell, in which it was very clear that there were co-conspirators, that there were other people who were enabling these crimes, that were facilitating what they were doing. And it is very clear from at least what we've seen in the Epstein files so far that the FBI and prosecutors were looking at other people in addition to Ghislaine Maxwell. And, again, what came of that, we don't know, but they were clearly investigating and talking to various other people. And so, yeah, it does raise questions. A lot of questions need to be raised about the fact that first, when Trump's DOJ came in February of 2025, they said, you're going to see everything. The public deserves to know, we're going to make these files public. And then they, according to some reporting from Bloomberg, they had over 1,000 FBI agents, I believe, combing through the files, looking for any high-profile individuals, looking for Donald Trump's name, and redacting that information, redacting their names. And so, and then you're getting these kind of releases of information where they're telling you, well, we're giving you something new. We're the most transparent administration in history. Here's a binder of documents, but those documents were already public. So this idea that, it seemed like they were trying to pull a fast one. You're trying to protect the names of people, Donald Trump and others, in the documents. And then all of a sudden, the attorney general said that she went and told Donald Trump that his name was in the files, which is not something a prosecutor would normally do. And then all of a sudden, we don't see them. And then, fast forward 5 months later, there's a 2-page unsigned memo from the Department of Justice saying, yeah, we're actually not going to disclose anything. We're not going to tell you anything. And that kind of about face, when you change so drastically what you were saying, only after you went and told the president whose name is in the files, it raises all sorts of questions. And then when you go to interview the Deputy Attorney General, the number 2 at the Department of Justice, interviews the convicted sex trafficker, Ghislaine Maxwell, and gives her that platform, that audience. I mean, just to put it in perspective, not everybody gets an interview with prosecutors. Usually the prosecutors will talk to the attorneys of any defendant and get a kind of a preview. Is this going to be worth it to us? Can you cooperate and give us information against other people? Are you willing to accept responsibility for your own crimes? Are you showing remorse to your victims? A number of boxes need to be checked before that meeting even happens. And according to, this hasn't really gotten coverage, but in what I've seen from the Epstein files, it does appear that there was a meeting between Southern District of New York prosecutors and Ghislaine Maxwell's attorneys, without Maxwell present, where I would, again, that kind of a meeting is pretty standard, where they would have said, what does she, give us a preview of what she would say if we did sit down with her. And then it appears they never sat down with her. And so my guess is the reason they didn't sit down with her is exactly what we saw from the transcript of the interview she gave with the Deputy Attorney General. She denied everything. She denied her role. She denied, essentially, I never saw or heard Epstein do anything bad. I never did anything bad. And anybody she was asked about, they didn't do anything bad. I mean, it defies belief. I mean, it was completely disproven at the trial. So to give her that audience, to give her that platform, and then make that available, but not tell us what the victims said, and not make their reports to the FBI also public, to try and hold that back, that is so not what normally happens. And it really, I would imagine, sends the message to victims that, yeah, we're going to then reward her for doing something that's clearly not telling the truth, for saying she never abused anyone, for saying she didn't do these things. We're going to give her the country club prison stay, but we're not going to give you what you're asking for. And we're not going to make your stories told. And so I think that real frustration in how the department has handled this, it shows a real lack of respect for the victims. They're not giving them notice of when they go to court and ask for certain things to be unsealed. They're not letting them know, which is what prosecutors always do. You always talk to the victims' counsel. You let them know what's going on. You keep that communication open. And that, according to victims and what they've been filing in court, is not at all what's been happening. They're not getting that basic respect. They're getting lip service. And so for those reasons, this really stands out as a case where we do need transparency, because with transparency, then we as the public can demand accountability. We can say, hey, now that we see what's here, why aren't you following these leads? Why didn't you pursue, these other individuals? I think only then will those questions really get asked and hopefully answered.
Yeah, the way that the files being released has been handled, the way where the spotlight's being shown on individuals in this case, I can't help thinking that refusing to hand over the Epstein files and all of the conspiracies that the internet will produce from that and the assumptions that will be made aren't as bad as what would happen if we released the Epstein files. And for me, it's just basic human psychology assessment here, because you're either protecting yourself or you're protecting your interests. That's it. Those are the only two things, right? And then you have a look at what wonderful Bill and Hillary have been up to. They must have been busy, because they're missing some pretty important court dates, Kristy, and they've now been slapped with contempt of court. So you've got both sides of the political scheme that are involved in the shenanigans of Epstein, email scandals, all this kind of stuff, both acting really, really, really suspicious. What's your take on that?
So one thing I will say is that with respect to Bill Clinton in particular, because I don't know that I understand Hillary was, asked to speak before Congress and hasn't, but I don't know that there's much more with respect to her contacts with Epstein. Bill Clinton is obviously the one who's more interesting.
Yeah.
Trump's chief of staff, Susie Wiles, gave an interview to Vanity Fair, and she said she's acquainted with what's in the Epstein files, right? Like, she's been briefed on it. She said there's no suggestion there's no evidence that Bill Clinton engaged in any criminal wrongdoing. And I thought that was interesting because this is Donald Trump's chief of staff. She has no basis to say that unless it was true.
That is the equivalent of trust me, bro. Like that's what we're talking about here. Trust me, bro. You don't need to see the files, but trust me, bro, everything's fine. Okay.
I hear you. On the other hand, like, again, for her, like, that's not necessarily in Trump's best interest to say that. And so I thought that was interesting. And then we've seen so far in the first rollout of files, we saw a number of photos of him in a hot tub with women where there was a black box over the woman's face. And the White House put out, their press secretary, deputy press secretary, put out a number of posts on social media saying, well, look, this is him with victims. And that's not accurate. What the prosecutors have told the court is a lot of people can't be identified. We don't know who a lot of these people in the photos are. So in an abundance of caution, if we don't know if somebody's a victim or a minor or what else, we put a black box over their face. And so I think what you're seeing is, again, it's not to say it's not there, it's just, it's unclear. And you have a lot of just politicizing what is going on, even the rollout of let's get those photos out first, kind of, that I don't think that was by accident.
It did feel a little bit like that. It was very Clinton heavy. Okay. I mean, Winnie the Pooh was also pictured with Epstein. Okay. So I'm just saying no one is innocent in this. But that's an interesting what you're saying about, so if you can't identify someone, if it's just person 2 in the image, on the side of caution to just redact them. It kind of makes sense. I mean, for a fact there's going to be at least one person in a photo who was just kind of there and has never been to our party and has lived their life and has forgotten all about it. But we've got to ask ourselves, when we're talking about the island, Epstein, the survivor stories, the charges, the guy was mega convicted, and Clintons and a lot of these other individuals are still rubbing shoulders. You can't ignore that. You can't ignore that side of it all. And of course, the royal family as well. I don't think the world was prepared. I don't think the world's still prepared to find out the full extent of what's in those files. But I think we should be given a chance to deal with it ourselves rather than it being kept and bled out. Because we're past the point of anyone believing that we're ever going to get full disclosure on this. I really think we are.
Yeah, I mean, look, under the act, what is supposed to happen is they're supposed to produce the files, just make redactions for victims' information to protect them, but otherwise we're supposed to see what's in there. And that is not the approach that the Department of Justice has taken. What they're doing is saying there's a lot actually that you're not going to see. We're going to hide behind these things in U.S. legal law, the privileges. This is privileged because it's our work product, attorney work product, so you're not going to see it. Well, that's really important information. One of the things I think that victims have said that they wanted to see is the prosecution memo from the line prosecutor in Florida, when she initially said we should charge sex trafficking as federal sex trafficking in Florida. She had a 53-page indictment and an 80+ page prosecution memo. Those are the kinds of documents that people want to see. But when prosecutors are claiming, oh, well, there are all these privileges, you actually can't see those, you can't get an understanding of what the decision-making process is. That's exactly the kind of information that the Act was designed to tell us. So, I share your view that I think there's a lot more that we are expecting to see from the files than what is actually going to be shared with us.
Yeah, and it's the actions of Trump have been very interesting, right? Of course, we've got the peace board, I believe, is the latest project. Very interesting when you look at the peace board on a map. Okay, if I was worried about China, right, I would put a circle of countries around China that just gave me $1 billion and are now on my side too. It's incredible. But hey, listen, that's not what we're here to talk about. But Trump seems to be pretty hell-bent on keeping himself so busy that he does not have time to deal with the Epstein files. It kind of looks like, you know, the frantic ex-partner who's, you know, trying to just keep themselves busy without having to deal with anything. That's the vibe I'm getting from him. It really, really is. I mean, I don't know how you feel. I don't know how much of the public is going to be able to continue putting faith in individuals when these files are still withheld. Have you seen a shift in America with how people were asking, are now demanding? What's the vibe in New York surrounding it all?
So just today, the Deputy Attorney General was interviewed on Meet the Press, and he was asked about the Epstein files. And he said that there are over 500 attorneys who are spending 7 days a week reviewing these files.
Right.
And that he was asked, well, when are we going to see them? And he would not commit to a deadline. He said soon. It's the best we got. So again, it's kind of, the Act said 30 days. In 30 days, we're supposed to see all the files. And essentially their view is you'll get them when you'll get them. And there's, as you said, there's a lot going on in the United States right now. It's kind of, you know, new chaos every day. Yeah. And so I think it is hard for the public's attention to kind of stay focused on any one thing because there's just so much going on. In particular, at least for me, following legal developments, there's just a lot happening. So, but I do think the Epstein files continue to be something that the American public really cares about, wants to know about. I don't think that story is going away. And so I think this DOJ will continue to get asked questions about the Epstein files. And I also think, let's say that, you know, they don't release all of the files. They're supposed to explain, hey, if we're redacting information, here's why we're making the redactions that they're making. And again, they haven't done that at all. I'm not sure how much we're going to see in terms of explanations, but I do think there are other things that can be done to also get us information. For example, I mean, the victims are the ones that have the information that we're most interested in. When the Epstein files are made public, the first thing that I'll be doing is searching for FBI 302. That is a particular kind of report that the FBI agents make whenever they interview a witness or a victim. That is the report of all of the notes of those statements. So I would look for those, and then I would look for the documents that they're showing in those interviews. That would be kind of the starting place to getting the lay of the land and understanding what's there. And so those interviews notes, victims had lawyers in those interviews, right? Those lawyers also presumably took notes from those interviews. Those notes could be shared with members of Congress. And if this department does not make those notes available, the victims' lawyers can redact their own clients' information, and then produce those to members of Congress, and members of Congress can decide that they want to make that information public. I mean, there are other ways that members of Congress can investigate and try and get us information if they wanted to do so. And again, I think that the public really wants those answers because then we want to start demanding accountability.
There's two things you said that are quite interesting, right? The first one was at the start of this when you talked about the Diddy case, and he never got charged with racketeering, so the domino never fell to expand past Diddy. Is there quite a lot of moments like that in the legal process where you as a lawyer, if you can't get that domino to fall, that just has to be erased from your mind now. There's no point in you focusing on the bigger picture of Diddy if that racketeering domino hasn't fallen. And whether or not you think that's true or not, it must be difficult to have to pack things away that you've not got the evidence, or convince the judge. Is that right? Is that the right way of putting it? Convince the judge or the jury to make that first domino topple. How often do you rip your hair out during cases, things like that, when you come up against, like, look, clearly we've got a criminal enterprise here by the, massive criminal enterprise, but you just can't get it proven, right? Like, is that not just, like, I think that would be the one thing I wouldn't be able to cope with most if I was in your position. I would really struggle with it.
Yeah, so I think that, it depends on how the investigation proceeds. In most of the conspiracies that I investigated when I was a prosecutor, generally you kind of start from the bottom and you get kind of the lower level people, and then you look to flip them up to the next people and the next people, and you kind of make your way up the chain to get the top dog. And that's not what they did here with Sean Combs. It was a standalone. They just charged him with the racketeering conspiracy. And, they had, in terms of witnesses who testified, they had assistants of his testify, victims, various people that were in his orbit. But it was significant, and maybe this was significant to the jury too, that they did not have any witness who was an identified co-conspirator who had pled guilty to being part of the conspiracy. And so, again, when you're charging somebody with conspiracy, it's always nice as a prosecutor to have those witnesses who said, here's the conspiracy, let me tell you how it worked. Yes, it existed. Here's the structure of it. Here's how it was organized. Here's who I reported to. Here's what they told me to do. And they didn't have that insider to kind of give you that flavor. And, I don't know what led the jury to acquit him on that charge, but that generally, when you're prosecuting cases, is nice evidence to have when you're charging any conspiracy. So, I imagine that they were very frustrated by the acquittal there. And certainly anytime you kind of can't make it to the top of the conspiracy and secure a conviction, if you think that that it is merited and that there is proof beyond a reasonable doubt, those are frustrating moments for sure. But that's also our system. You have to be able to prove it in court, and he got his fair trial, and jury listened to the evidence and wasn't convinced. I'm not sure I would have come out the same way, but I wasn't on the jury and they were, and they saw evidence that, again, as you pointed out earlier, we did not see even in the courtroom. There were things, the more graphic videos that we were not able to see. So the benefit of all the evidence, that's how they came out.
Yeah, it's what do you think people could be forgiven in America and around the world for having a mindset of America has a system that you get the version of the law in America you can afford? I think that a lot of people have that mindset. And, as a joke, kind of funny. But when you actually imagine the reality of that, it's quite scary. And it's kind of prevalent in where you are in society, how you're treated. And again, that is then connected to your own connections. And Maxwell's the example of that. Okay. We won't start picking at the label of why she gets all this privilege. But do you think people could be forgiven for having that mindset when you look into the American legal system?
So a few things I would say about that. One thing I will say that completely shocked me when I started as a prosecutor was how talented the federal public defenders were. I was expecting, hey, they're appointed, they're federal defenders, they're not getting paid, those cases will be easier. They fought us harder. They, generally speaking, had really stellar backgrounds, were true believers in the system that everybody deserves, zealous advocacy and the right to a defense. And they, I mean, in my experience, they were some of the hardest cases I had going up against them, because they really would hold our feet to the fire. They'd be the first to say if they thought we made, any kind of hint of misconduct. If they thought it was there, they would run with it. And again, that's certainly not a fault. That's how they should be proceeded. They should be providing that zealous advocacy. So I was shocked by that, frankly, and that was a good thing, I think, for the system, that people who couldn't afford attorneys were able to have such a great defense. Sure. I don't know that that's the way it is everywhere. I would expect it is not. This was very specific to my experience in the Southern District of New York. I don't know that every district is that way. I certainly don't know if that's the case, federal versus state, but that at least was my experience, and something I found heartening. That said, to your point, for the people that can afford really high-priced counsel, who a lot of them were former prosecutors who worked in the very offices that are bringing the cases, they know how the system works. They, in fact, in many cases, may know the prosecutors. And so that does certainly give somebody an advantage to having that kind of experienced counsel, to know, hey, I need to demand meetings with not just the line prosecutors. If I don't get the answer I want there, I'm going to go to their chief. And then if I don't get the answer I want there, I'm going to go to the chief of the criminal division. And then I'll take it all the way up to the U.S. attorney or to the Department of Justice, and keep demanding these meetings and demanding to be heard, potentially before charges are even brought. That can happen in investigations if the investigation is overt and it's known to the persons who is being investigated, to their attorneys. So, again, for others that don't have those resources to keep kind of pleading their case even before a charge is brought, and then once, if charges are brought, to keep fighting every step of the way, in before the trial even happens, and pretrial, to get evidence thrown out, to bring any number of legal challenges to the case. That is certainly a disadvantage. The better legal counsel you have, and the better your chances are of beating the charges. So I don't, it's. Yeah, I'm with you. It is unfortunate. It's an unfortunate thing.
It sounds like a percentage of it is based on the complications and the vastness of the legal system. And if you've worked for both sides and have worked in the system for 20 years and have another 20 years worth of knowledge, it makes sense that you would have a better understanding of loopholes and shenanigans in both sides. So it seems like a byproduct of the progression of a lawyer's career, to be honest with you, because it seems like there's quite a lot of books to be read, and you got to get through them all. In some senses, I'm sure there's evil, powerful people. But the next thing I want to ask you is,
can I just say one quick thing about that before we move? So it is also why it is so important when you have these people who are former prosecutors and who know the system so well, that they go on, if they go on to these big law firms and become partners there, that they do pro bono work, that they do give back. And they don't just give back to the cases that, potentially President Trump tells them he thinks are worthy of their time, but that they give back to the people who in society are the most vulnerable and do need legal counseling. Boy, do we have a lot of people in that boat right now.
Is there not states where, as a lawyer, you're legally required to do an X amount of pro bono work a year? Is that not a thing?
It certainly varies state by state. I wouldn't be able to say that's a universal
that's fine.
But it should be. It's something every attorney should do for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So when we talk about victim survivor testimonies, I don't know how much attention you paid to the internet over the last couple of weeks. There's been a viral statement from a former Gulf War veteran by the name of Sasha Riley, who has come forward with testimony pointing the finger directly at Trump as the ringleader of the Epstein case. And it's you'll know yourself if you've ever heard survivor testimonies. There's green light and red light things that can flag up for whether somebody's up to no good, shall you say. And there was a lot of green flags that were ticked with Sasha. And he emphasizes the paper trails that people could use to kind of put his case together. And when you added a testimony like that, which is unconfirmed, I just want to point that out there, this is all unconfirmed. And I just want to point out as well, if somebody has got the capabilities of putting together an attempted assassination on the president, you can assume that the levels that people will go to derail someone have no ends, right? And again, I say that because everything is still unconfirmed. I'm not taking anything away from the story. Have you heard the testimony? Do you know what I'm talking about? You've not. That's fine.
I'm so sorry, I have not. I'm not familiar with this particular individual.
It's a really tough testimony. Do you think? Have you ever seen anything where you felt you're witnessing something, and you don't have to name any names, but have you ever felt you've witnessed something in a case where you're like, that someone's being protected here? There's a feeling of above the law with an individual. Have you ever kind of got that feeling?
I can't. So I prosecuted a number of sex trafficking cases. The cases that I prosecuted were with, one example was, a Mexican sex trafficking case where it was essentially a sex trafficking organization in Tenancingo, Mexico. And so you had, just it'd been going on for over a decade, and you had, girls who were defrauded to becoming part of that ring, beaten to become part of that ring, forced, coerced in all the worst ways. That organization within its community was certainly very powerful. But I can't say I ever felt like that was a situation where I felt like anybody was protecting them ultimately. And it took a lot of work, but we got the cooperation of Mexican legal authorities to extradite those individuals that we had charged and bring them to the United States to be accountable. So, I'm not sure, but what I can say is whenever someone is coming in to meet with a prosecutor, and however many times if they're in that chair, their accusations are serious. And so it's the job of the prosecutor to kind of put aside who it is that is being accused. It shouldn't matter from a prosecutor's perspective. You should be investigating that case thoroughly and seeking to find ways, can this person's account be corroborated? If they're saying they were in this on this day at this time, this is when they were with that person, can I get the travel records? Can I get their bank records? Can I find ways to show that the details that they are providing are accurate and can be verified in some way? Are there other witnesses that can be pointed to that they may have told at the time about what happened, or that there were other victims? I mean, there are any number of ways where you hear a story and you should be thinking, how would that investigation unfold to be able to really assess whether or not this person is being credible and telling the truth. The Department of Justice noted that there were certain things in the Epstein files, allegations with respect to Donald Trump, and they said those were allegations that were made, I think, before I want to say the 2020 election maybe, and that they found them not to be credible. And I guess, that to me raises more questions. Well, was there an investigation done into the allegations? Was a prosecutor ever looking at those accusations and made a determination that they were not credible? Who investigated?
Right.
When did that happen? Now, or is it just the White House making that determination? Like, again, all of those things, when you have these accusations against powerful people, it raises questions about the process, and you want to make sure that was done by the book. And this case, again, in many ways has been very abnormal, and it raises questions as to what was.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, let's put a pin in the elites for a second, okay? Because I think people would be pretty shocked at how much transportation takes place in the world that doesn't have bells and whistles on it. It's not Hollywood. It's not the elites. It's not a multi-million-dollar empire. It's 4 or 5 poor individuals that are stuck in the back of a van and shifted about the place or flown here, flown there. Take us through the reality of the entire trafficking legal world, because I imagine this is the top dog crime now, because it's way easier to have a girl in the back of a car, right, and get caught with that and talk your way out of it than a kilo of powder. You know, the criminality seems to have veered towards the simplisticness of sex trafficking and the horrible nature that it is. Can you just take us through the realities of the grassroots as opposed to the top echelon side of it all, Kristy?
Yeah, so I will say when I first started as a prosecutor in 2010, there really, at least in my district, there hadn't been sex trafficking cases brought. I actually prosecuted the first sex trafficking case that went to trial, and we got a conviction. That was one sex trafficker, one victim, and we still brought the case. It was my first trial, and and
that's iconic. That's iconic right there. Just to say, I mean, that's massive.
Well, what the interesting part about that case is that was sex trafficking, one pimp of a 16-year-old girl, so a minor. And that one individual who trafficked this girl, and he had a handwritten playbook of essentially how to break her spirit and to break the spirit of girls that he was working with. It was truly horrific. And so that one individual, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison after being convicted at trial. And I note that it was 20 years because that is the same sentence Ghislaine Maxwell received. So these are, we're talking the Epstein case about over 1,000 victims. I had a case with one victim, and it was such horrific conduct that was involved that the judge felt 20 years was appropriate. And the mandatory minimum in that case was 15 years, and he went above it. So again, all of these cases, even if they don't involve somebody who you've ever heard of before, when you get down to what happened and how these young girls are exploited, it is truly tragic. And you see a lot of the same things over and over again. The girls that are targeted, girls who often are isolated in some way. They may have suffered sexual abuse in their childhood before. They may have suffered from drug abuse. They're people who are easily isolated from family and from friends, defrauded into not necessarily even thinking that they were going to be involved in sex trafficking. Maybe they thought they were going to be in a relationship with their trafficker. You see a lot of the grooming of conduct with these girls, making them think certain things are okay and sex acts are okay, and that it's not the violation that it is. And they really find ways to gain the trust of the victims, and then as that one case I had shows, find ways to really break their spirit and to try to break their spirit so that they won't fight back, they won't leave, they won't seek to escape. The common question you always get in these cases, well, why didn't she just leave? That is easier said than done in a lot of circumstances, especially like in my Mexican sex trafficking case, where you had a number of people, the victims whom were brought into the United States, but they were not here legally. And so they were taught to fear law enforcement, and that if you go to law enforcement, nobody's going to listen to you. They're going to throw you in jail for years and years and years.
Convince you that you're a criminal yourself. They convince you that you're a criminal, and if you open your mouth, you'll go down as well. You hear it all the time in Survivor. There's a word for it, by the way. There's actually it's grooming, and then this is something else. I just can't remember the correct terminology for it. And that fear that they instill in these men, women, children that are all part of this horrific cycle. I mean, they have really refined. You talked about like a manuscript on how to break these people down. I've seen the same things for children and all kinds of horrible stuff, where people don't seem to realize that if you're a fan of fishing, Kristy, and you go on Facebook and join a fishing page and you talk all excitedly about fishing, that's how these people are discussing refining their skill sets in their communities. And people don't believe it. I've seen it. I have witnessed arguments between two different types of child predator arguing over who is the better, more purist child predator. It's bonkers. It's bonkers. And I think these cases that don't get attention, right? I think do you think that if the public really knew the true extent of the gravity, and it wasn't just a quick flash on the news saying $100 billion industry, do you think people really understand the gravity of the human transportation industry? You think? Because I believe it's completely underreported on.
I think until you've really had the opportunity to talk to any of the victims of these kinds of horrific crimes, it is difficult to really appreciate just the magnitude of what it entails. And I think that what we've started to see, at least in the United States, is, and I think you were making this point earlier, with respect to gang activity. Gangs often are trafficking in drugs, but we did see a shift where they would start to traffic in young girls, and that was a way for them to make money. But they, the product, as they referred to it, right, was the girl. You didn't have to continue to get new drugs and new supply. They had these girls they could continue to exploit day after day after day. And so for them, it was cheaper. And that was a really grotesque, I think, way to get introduced, I think, to this world for me, to kind of see the depravity in the ways that that these gangs were viewing young girls and women. That was really, I think, hard for me to when I first started doing this work. But that was something that became more and more prevalent, at least during my tenure when I was a prosecutor. And I don't know that is something that people fully appreciate, the various methods in which a number of gangs in the United States, at least, the ways in which they're conducting criminal activity. It's not just drugs, it's not just violence, like it is also human trafficking in a lot of circumstances.
100 million. And you know what? Let's take the gangs out for a minute. Let's go a step further back. There are millions of people who are cleaning people's houses, who are brought over here for jobs, and ain't no one getting paid. Okay. And there's scary statistics out there that the slave business is more flourishing now than it ever has been. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think in the history of mankind, there may have been one, no one has actually ever been prosecuted as a slave trader in the, like, ever, apparently. Okay, we can Google it, we can see. Do you think that the misconception is that they need to be looking out for these, disheveled young girls in the backs of cars, and people are missing out on all of these other individuals who are also in the trafficking world, but it's not necessarily the sex industry, it's labor?
Yes. So I've investigated a number of cases where there were allegations of forced labor. That in the United States would be the statute. And those, you can look at situations where, yes, the victims are coming forward, they're getting paid well below the minimum wage, working hours well beyond sort of a 9 to 5 of what you'd expect, just really abusive work conditions. in some circumstances, really not being permitted to leave, whether if the person does not have legal status in the United States, where their documentation may be held, like a passport or a visa may be withheld from their trafficker or abuser. Any number of ways in which they can use kind of this coercion or control to keep that person working indentured servitude, where they are told, we brought you to the United States, you need to then work your debt off and you need to continue to work for us. And those cases are hard to make because, first and foremost, it is hard to find those individuals who are willing, again, to not be so scared of law enforcement that they will actually sit down with prosecutors and with investigators and tell their stories. And those cases in particular with forced labor is where the non-governmental organizations, the NGOs, are so important. Any of those investigations I had is because an NGO brought a victim to the office and said, you really should, this is somebody who's willing to talk to you. And they had kind of before, because we're not the lawyer for the victim. We don't represent the victim. We represent the United States and the government. The victims always need their own lawyers, even though we do, we do look for vindicating victims' interests. We are not their lawyers. And so when they have good lawyers and good counselors and people who are looking out for them and kind of explaining how the system works and letting them know this is not legal and you can get recourse here. And there are ways, if you bring that case, for example, and you don't have legal status, that you can get a visa to be able to stay here. Things like that they can kind of give them the lay of the land and explain why it may make sense for them to come forward with their stories. Those cases are so important. They are difficult to make. Just again, getting the victims in the door, getting the corroboration of what happened, but they're really important.
Okay, final thing I want to talk to you about is social media, the modern world. Ever since lockdown, everyone's a podcaster, everyone's a journalist. Your iPhone is your broadcasting network. We recently seen the massive fraud case be exposed on YouTube. What's your take on what the regular person has brought to some cases through social media, information traveling faster, and of course, what is definitely not a tracking device set up by the government, okay, that we all pay a monthly fee for to keep in our pockets? Do you think it's a hindrance or is it assisted in some way?
What fraud case from a social? I just want to make sure.
Hang on 1 second. Yeah, sorry, I forget you're from the legal world and I talk out facts like it's just nonsense. 1 second. So I think it was Minnesota fraud case. Hang on.
So that's an interesting case. That case of fraud in Minnesota was brought by U.S. attorney in Minnesota, prosecutors there, and the prosecutor that brought that case, that investigated that case, that had that takedown, has now since resigned.
Obviously. Listen, there's nothing suspicious about that at all, Kristy. Okay, you get accused of fraud, and then suddenly you quit your job and run away.
Oh no! This is the prosecutor who discovered the fraud and prosecuted.
Who discovered the fraud? Okay, I beg your pardon.
Yeah. So that prosecutor has resigned because that prosecutor refused, essentially, in connection with other events in Minnesota, to conduct an investigation of Renee Good, who died in Minnesota in a shooting by an ICE officer. He refused to investigate her widow. And at least there's public reporting from the New York Times that led to his resignation and the resignation of 5 other prosecutors in that office. Now, that is a prosecutor who, again, unveiled and brought this case of a very significant fraud. And now the prosecutor who led that is no longer leading the charge there. So that is that's very troubling. As to social media being able to uncover fraud, it's hard to say. I think that I think that there can be questionable methods sometimes when people try to take matters into their own hands. When you try to go, for example, to childcare facilities and demands to see the children, there are obviously safety concerns with that. I don't want childcare facilities, as a parent, to just let any stranger from the street go on and see children and see what's going on. So
you don't have to worry. You don't have to worry, because there was no children at the Quality Leering Center. Okay, when you have somebody taking billions of dollars from the American government, and it takes individuals reporting on it on social media to get anything moving. Okay, this case was stagnant until this blew up on social media, and I wouldn't want people walking into where my children are, but luckily there was no children here. The whole thing was a scam. And the fact that you have a Quality Learning Center misspell their own sign and no one noticed for so long, it's a scary concept. And it's one of the few cases where good has come from social media. And I think what you touched on there about the questionable ways that some people go about doing things. We've just seen the DoorDash girl, the supposed victim of this unconscious man in his own home. She's facing a pretty serious jail sentence. And if it wasn't for the ring cam, that would have been very different. And it blew up in her face, really.
Yeah, I with respect to the Minnesota fraud, I'm not sure I'm willing to give the credit to the YouTuber for breaking that case. I think
I'm with you.
Was brought by career prosecutors and FBI agents. I don't know that he uncovered anything that
it just coincidentally got traction after he put that out there. So in my opinion, if it wasn't him that got it kickstarted, why was there not this level of prosecutions and investigation prior to him revealing it? That's another thing that I would have an issue with, because
I hear you, but with that level of fraud, when you're talking about millions and millions of dollars of fraud, those fraud cases take months, if not years, to build.
Or just walk into the place.
You have to do. I mean, there's
just go down there. You would just go down there, though, right? You would just go down to the Leering Center, and as the investigator, investigate, right?
That's certainly one aspect of it, and I don't know. My guess.
I mean, it would make sense.
They just didn't put it on YouTube.
It would make sense if I'm
brought it to a grand jury.
Sure, but again, if I'm in charge of prosecuting a case, it makes sense for me to go to the places that are being accused of the fraud and to witness it. So I imagine if they had done that and they'd put their findings out there, but I don't think a lawyer could go down and investigate and then put it out there publicly. So maybe that's why things are slower, and I shouldn't be so harsh on the lawyers, whereas a YouTuber can just be like, evidence, I think, and put it out there, and the court of public opinion maybe fast track stuff. But you can't, for me, it's the data lines are social media expose legal ramifications. It all lines up.
So I prosecuted a lot of healthcare fraud cases, and it was often the case that you would send undercover FBI agents to go see doctors who claimed to be performing services that they weren't performing, for example. That's one example. One case that I prosecuted was a big fraud case involving former NBA players, National Basketball Association players, where they were saying we were going to get dental work and we were going to see chiropractors, and they're submitting invoices for services that they never received. And a big part of that, an investigation like that can be sending in undercover agents to go check out these facilities, check out the doctors, check out what's going on. And again, but the key there is undercover, right? You're trying.
Well, I think the key there is. I think the key there is they're not investigating the U.S. government. They're investigating private healthcare facilities that are putting fraudulent. They're committing fraud, right? whereas you would be directly investigating the US government for allowing this level of funding to go unchecked for so long. And I think that's where I see a difference there, because why was no one sent in undercover to these places if it's common practice, if that makes sense?
I think, and I guess my point to that is I just don't know, and it's possible that they did. Again, if you take down an investigation like that, which the prosecutor in Minnesota did, my guess is that they can't air it until they bring it. There are certain rules around the grand jury where there's secrecy, and they
100%.
can't let you know until they've actually presented it, a grand jury's voted on it, and then they present their evidence at a trial. So when that trial in that case happens, I expect we will see a lot of that evidence of how it is that they built the case that we haven't seen thus far.
You know, you just saying that's made me realize something else. So technically, if you were smart, you could weaponize a YouTuber by leaking some information, have him do an investigation like this, put it out there, and then have the public disarray, have that public push to push a case forward. I'm not saying that's what's happened, but because you can't talk about it, you can't get the public riled up until the case is over. So it's the opposite of how a journalist would work. You got to keep it all secret, whereas they put it all out there. And
so if prosecutors and investigators did that and they shared information that was secret under like our rules, then you could face a lot of a lot of problems if you were to do that. And again, the biggest issue is your evidence could end up getting thrown out. It could be viewed as tainted in any number of ways. So there's a lot of reason why investigators and prosecutors are going to want to try and keep things secret until the public needs to know about it.
Let's not be silly here. I mean, you just write something down on a napkin and slide it over a table, and then you know the leak in the source is out there. I mean, we leading by the example of Trump, you know, even if the law says you've got to do something, you don't necessarily have to do what the law is telling you to do. I mean, that's the precedent that's being set here. So I imagine that could exist. But I mean, obviously, it would have to be super secretive, man. But it's an interesting concept to think if there are legal roadblocks that people come up against, weaponizing social media to stir up the public to push the case through. It's an interesting. I mean, I wouldn't want to get caught doing it. It's kind of like insider trading. Do you know what I mean? It's like it'd be on the same level as that.
So one thing that we've seen, there are rules in every district in the United States which tell the lawyers that are a part of any case, you can talk about what's public. So if there's a charging instrument, you can talk about that. If it's set in court, you can talk about it. But beyond that, you can't talk about your cases because you could be prejudicing the criminal defendant's right to a fair trial, right? You can't poison the jury against a case, right? You have to talk about what's publicly known, but no more than that. You got to keep everything else close to the vest. And if you violate that, the case can get thrown out. So when I see, for example, prosecutors that are affiliated with this Department of Justice making statements about various high-profile cases that are, one is Kilmar Abrego Garcia. In that case, the judge in the case said there's real concerns here about, prosecutors saying that this man is a human trafficker, that this man is a terrorist, that all of these things that are not necessarily what you've put in an indictment and charged him with, and you're poisoning the jury. And actually on Wednesday of this week, there's going to be a hearing about whether or not this was a vindictive prosecution, and therefore his indictment should get thrown out entirely. So that's the kind of worry in doing the kinds of things that you're suggesting of
I'm with you.
That's why you don't do it, because you could lose your entire case if you do it and you're caught doing it. So again, right now you've got prosecutors who are saying things about criminal defendants on social media. They're just putting it out there on X. And those kind of statements now a judge is going to look at it and say, like, was that appropriate? Did you break the rules? Should the case still go forward? It's a real risk.
Okay, last little point. How do you think AI is going to affect the legal system moving forward? We've seen a lot of, police report writing camera suggestions, and I even think last year, the year before, there was people trying to represent themselves in court with Chat GPT as their lawyer and things like this. Like, do you feel, not next year, not 5 years from now, but in the same way as jobs are disappearing, right? Do you see a time where I'll go to the Apple law firm for a freaking AI generated legal representative? Do you think we're going to get to that point?
No, I do think that it is concerning. There have been cases where lawyers are using AI to help write their briefs. And in particular, in some of those cases where that's happened, AI is kind of making up cases that don't actually exist. And then people are figuring out that that's happening, and the judges are saying, should we sanction you, for not doing that? Even if you didn't know that these are fake cases, you should have known better. You're a lawyer, you have to do your own research, and you have to, even if you use ChatGPT or any other AI to kind of as a resource, maybe you have to verify the sources you're using, and that make sure that they're accurate and the citation is accurate. And so there are lawyers who've gotten in a lot of trouble already for their reliance on AI. And look, I'm not here to tell you all AI is bad. I think AI can be very useful.
That's definitely not. I'm not trying to push you for that. What you see in the background here, all these law books, right? This is the impression I have of a lawyer. I imagine you go into work, there's a lot of like mahogany bookshelves full of books, right? Tens of and hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of books, right? Is there a database where all of this is digitized for you as a lawyer, or do you have to remember volume 7, paragraph 17 of the blah 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 blah? Or is there a big database where you can go, hey, I think this rule or legislation applies to this typey, and it will bring it up for you?
Yeah, so there are databases, Lexis, Westlaw being the two main ones, at least in the United States, that we use, where everything, that's electronic. So, part of, having a show on YouTube where I talk about different cases, there's always some new area of law that I am, learning about. My background is in criminal law, but, I'm always looking to see what else is, what new relevant legal cases come up, and I'll often go to to make sure that I'm up to date on any new cases, in particular if they're districts outside of New York where the law may be different. Going to those cases and making sure that I'm current and up to speed. I don't have lots of hard copy books. I generally tend to use those databases to get the cases, or even there are public court dockets that you can go to. So if you wanted to look for all of poll filings from the Maxwell case or the Epstein case, that's all public information you can just pull electronically. Anything that is unsealed and is public, you can just get that electronically. So that's what I tend to do. But certainly can't speak for everybody else.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking is, do you feel that the possible future of AI within law and the legal world is focusing on you being assisted by AI, explaining a case, and its references for responses are through the pages of these legal books, of these databases? There is no fake cases that could be brought up. It's almost like using a calculator to solve a math question. It's saving the human reading and going through it all. And then obviously you cross-reference and you check stuff. Do you think there's a place for being assisted with the amount of work and gathering of data that must be required?
Yeah, it will be very interesting to see where it goes. I know there are a lot of people in the legal field who are looking at ways to use AI to better, make the systems more efficient. But and as you said, really assist in what lawyers are doing. And I think where it can be useful potentially is in processing a lot of data. But in terms of actual legal conclusions, and I would never trust AI, for example, to read a case and tell me what it stands for.
Sure.
Like I would want to make sure to do that research on my own, or work with somebody who I trust who's doing that research to make sure that the case is still good law, it hasn't been overturned on that main point. Like there's so many nuances to it that are these facts even comparable to what our fact pattern is here? Like there's so much of it that I think does, and maybe this is just me selfishly hoping that our lawyers like me are not out of a job, but I do think that level of the analysis of it and the interpretation of it, and what does this case mean, and that piece of it just seems so human that I don't know that AI is going to replace it, but I certainly think AI can assist. I find ways in which AI is helpful is in particular with with styles of writing and finding ways. Hey, I've written something. Can you make this more? Like make this a little tighter if I'm tending to be wordy. Are there ways to kind of make this more digestible, and kind of giving those prompts and looking, and sometimes what you get doesn't really work, but other times you'll get something and it may have a good idea. And again, you can't just cut and paste, I think is the key. Whatever you're getting from AI, you really still need to use your own judgment as to, does this look right? Is this something that that makes sense to me? Are these facts verifiable facts? Really, facts still matter. Making sure your sources are verified, I think, still matters.
Yeah. And do you find that as time's progressing, you're adding additional uses for AI throughout your workload or research, or is it mainly just sort of stayed the same? It's like what you just said there. Or do you feel like you're adding on little extra things that because for me, I feel like it's a trust issue people have. And 30 years from now, where's that trust level going to be? Is it going to be, oh, well, we've had the first AI eye surgery, we trust the AI doctors now? I mean, that's just how our brains stupidly progress in this world. And I fall victim to it myself. I'm using AI for things now that I didn't use 6 months ago. And the human condition is fascinating once we let a trust barrier down and we let something in. You don't think about it too much when it's just you, but when you think about it from a global collective, it's going to be interesting to see just how much faith and how much trust is put in something. And again, it comes down to the alleged evil overlords that control the world that we all put our mistrust in, that make all of these things a bad idea. You know what I mean? But Kristy, really, thank you so much for coming and chatting with us. It's an incredible insight into when we, the public, demand the pound of flesh, okay, and the lawyers have to go in, and if you can't get those dominoes to fall, your hands are tied. And I think it's interesting, because I think that's one thing I miss a lot with why the hell are the lawyers not getting X, Y, and Z in cases done. It's a complicated minefield of this and that. And I imagine in some cases, taking what you can get from the evidence you've got, right?
Yeah, look, I think you want lawyers to be, in particular, again, speaking to criminal law in particular, you want prosecutors to do things by the book. You don't want them to be cutting corners just to get a result, right? You want them to be doing things the right way. And if that means that you can't meet your burden, even if you think this is probably the person that's committed a crime, and but you don't have a solid case, then your answer needs to be to back away and to see if you can build a stronger case, see if you're missing something, but don't just jump the gun, to kind of work the process the way it should. That said, I mean, I think there are ways that we could be better about explaining certain things. Some things, again, are secret by nature of the rules that apply and can't be shared with the public. But a lot of times there are things that can be shared and are in the public interest to be shared. And so, you know, I think it's a fine line, but not appearing too lawyerly and being, you know, reason people say like you're making things more complicated than they need to be. This is why people hate lawyers. Like, why are you speaking in lawyer speak? Just speak plainly so I understand.
The irony
there
is,
is something to that.
Yeah. But I imagine the irony is, though, you're making it as simple as you possibly can, right? I mean, this is the simple version that we think is the drawn out, complicated version, I would imagine, right? Because I'm like, we just hear the court snippets. You know, it's like the iceberg, right? The court is the little bit of the investigation. There's the other 90% where you're, you know, 12 black coffees deep into a weekend of research and, you know, seen daylight and stuff like that. I mean, that must be the realities as well. And it's just, thank you so much for coming and talking to us. What's next for you? What have you got coming up? Your links are in the description, of course. Courtside on YouTube. What's coming up with you next? Tell us about it.
Well, you're showing it. So I'm really trying to grow my channel. It's still relatively new, so I am still working on that, and hopefully I will have the success that you've had with your over 1 million subscribers. I'm not anywhere close to where you are, but seeing people who have used the platform as successfully as you have, it's inspiring, and it's nice to see that there is a space, a platform where people do want to hear about these kind of, you know, complicated issues, you know, and hear people have these important conversations. So I really thank you for having me on and giving me a chance to talk to you today.
You're very, very welcome. And I just want to say thank you for being here. Thank you to the Sean Atwood channel. Thank you to the mods. Thank you to the admins. And make sure you go and subscribe. The links are all down in the description. And we'll speak again one day, Kristy, because there's a lot, I would imagine, that people are going to want to ask someone like yourself. So maybe we'll arrange like a Q&A with yourself, because I really think that you give over the information really, really well. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you guys for watching. Please like and subscribe and share. We'll see you in the next one. And from me, Ron Swanson, as always, be safe out there, guys. Peace.